How's that now?
Right, can we try again? Right, so now we can proceed. Well, I've had 60 years of research experience in Morecambe Bay, research interest in Morecambe Bay, and I thought it was probably an appropriate time to have a look at the changes which have been taking place in the bay over the last 60 years. And particularly, I want to focus on the Kent estuary, but before that it is important to look at Morecambe Bay in general. So we'll start by just taking a general view, a general aerial view of Morecambe Bay. Just to introduce Morecambe Bay, I thought this aerial photograph was really quite useful. It's just taken from a commercial flight by a friend of a friend, and here you can see Feasham Harbour and the Lune estuary, and then looking in this direction northeastwards, we're looking up towards the head of the Kent estuary. Grange is there, the Cartmel Peninsula here, and the Leven estuary there. The Furness Peninsula, I'm afraid, is off to the left. Now, perhaps rather duller looking is this map, but it does obviously name all the main features. So Morecambe Bay, approximately 10 miles square, as it were, 10 miles in northeast to southwest direction, also northwest to southeast direction. A number of estuaries, the Leven estuary, the Kent estuary in the north, the Keir estuary here, coming through near Carnforth, the Lune estuary, which you've already seen on the previous slide, and then the Wyre coming in from the south. You'll notice that there are various contours here which are actually showing the main tidal channels. The very main channel is the Lune Deep, which of course is the main shipping channel leading to Heysham. Up towards the head of the estuary, there are channels here which are mainly produced by the river, but the tidal channels link in to them. The bed of Morecambe Bay is almost entirely of sand, which you'll probably be well aware of. And you can see, I think over here, I'm sorry I can't see it very clearly, so maybe you can't, but this map was actually drawn from Admiralty charts, which were surveyed in in 1964 and 1965. And the channels up here were drawn from air photographs from 1964. So this is really the start of the 60-year period that we're going to be having a look at. There are important processes, of course, going on in Morecambe Bay, and tidal processes are extremely important. This is just, there's a pair of slides here which show a high spring tide, that's what HWST stands for, at Bear in 1974, the 10th of February. This is high water. You can see the tide is actually back against, or in, actually passing over slightly onto the promenade. And this is just about 6.5 hours later, low water, and you can see a completely different aspect. The tides are extremely large in Morecambe Bay. You may have realised this yesterday when there was an extremely high tide in the middle of the day. Now this shows a chart of Hessian tides. Now these are actually recorded tides for a sample month, the month of May 2020. This shows the very big tidal range here. The highest range was actually what we got yesterday, of about 10.5 metres. So a very big tide indeed, from high water to low water of over 10 metres. But these are spring tides, which are related to the full moon and the new moon. The neap tides, which occur at the time of the quarters of the moon, are very much smaller, only in fact about 3.5 metres. So a very big change from the springs here to the neaps. So these, as I say, are recorded tides. So these include both the predicted tide, which is an astronomical tide relating to the moon, as I've said, and also other astronomical bodies. But the actual tides also include meteorological effects. So the line at the bottom is called a residual, which is the red line here, and this is showing the difference between the predicted tide and the actual tide which occurs. And you can see, there's the zero, there's very little difference along much of the line here, but there was a considerable bleep, as it were, here, blip rather than bleep, of about 1 metre. And this was produced by a very strong southwest storm. So the tides, in fact, are clearly very important indeed in shaping the bed of the bay and also affecting the coast. Here you can see another feature of the tides, and that is the tidal bore. And there will have been a considerable tidal bore yesterday, and also, in fact, today, because the tide was only slightly lower today than it was yesterday. So here you can see the flood tide of the bore, very powerful, coming up at Park Point. And you can also see evidence of the ebb tide, which is flowing out against it. The flood tide with the bore will override this and then gradually spread out over the sandbanks. In fact, I've been watching this at the shore at Silverdale this lunchtime, and it was quite interesting, but obviously not a large bore because there's no large channel there at the present time. Now, the other main influence in Morecambe Bay is, of course, the waves. And here you can see storm waves at Hessian Head on the 13th of November 77. Now, 2 days before that, 11/11/77, so a very memorable date, there was a very big storm surge in Morecambe Bay on top of a high spring tide. The high spring tide was predicted to be about 10.1 metres, and then the surge was 1.85 metres on top of that. So in other words, the tide actually rose to about 12 metres, and the result was very considerable flooding all the way around the bay. Quite a lot of damage, changes to these cliffs here at Hessian, and particularly noteworthy perhaps was the West End Pier at Morecambe was severely damaged and had to be demolished. But that was a very big storm surge, which clearly can have a marked effect on the bay. Right, now having said this by way of introduction, I want to turn to the Kent estuary, and first of all we'll have a look at the Silverdale area. This is the Silverdale Salt Marsh as it was in March 1965. You won't see anything like it at the present time. Here you can see there's a wide salt marsh, which in fact has started to develop in 1915 and gradually extended seaward. The marsh was very extensively grazed by sheep, and the other activity, which you can see here, was turf cutting. The salt marsh surface was prepared, fertilised and so on, and then it was cut for very high quality turf. It was used, for example, in bowling greens and the like. So this is an activity that was quite important back in the 1960s. Now this is a vertical aerial photograph taken 21st of August 1964. And you can see here the extent of the Silverdale Salt Marsh, and Silverdale is here, the main village. Park Point is over there, Jenny Brown's Point is down here. And you can see that all this dark area here is in fact salt marsh. So there was, in 1964, a very extensive salt marsh. It was virtually 1 kilometre wide here at the cove, which you'll probably be quite familiar with. You can see that there are channels in the salt marsh. Seaward of the salt marsh there are extensive sandbanks with relatively small channels leading from the creeks. So this was what the situation was in Silverdale in 1964. So quite a distinctive coast which was extensively grazed by sheep and was also used for turf cutting. Now if we look across the estuary, we come to Kent's Bank, so just to the south of Grange, and here at the beginning of a cross-bay walk, in fact, there were a number of people gathered on a very rocky shore. You can see how sort of rocky, rubbly, a little bit of sand down here, but none of the salt marsh that you may be familiar with at the present time. Seaward of this beach, this is at Kent's Bank Station, just to give you a precise location, just down below the station. You can see there was a sandbank here adjacent to it, not very wide, but the main channel for the River Kent was quite close to the shore here. And then beyond that, there were more sandbanks. So that was what Kent's Bank was like in 1963. And just going on a couple of years, still staying on the west side of the Kent estuary, there is the major channel here, you can see, is very close to Humphrey Head. So in other words, it was very, very close indeed to the west side of the estuary. Now the next 4 slides are a series of maps which I and others have drawn from a series of aerial surveys of the Kent estuary across the period from the 1960s to the 1990s. And these were drawn specifically to look at the relationship between the channels and the salt marsh. So you'll see in this sequence that there is quite a change going on over this period. So 1963, there was a survey of the whole of the estuary. You can see that the main channel lay from Arnside down to Blackstone Point, right along the coast. It then swung across to the Grange to Kent's Bank and Humphrey Head side of the estuary. And there were extensive sandbanks on the eastern side of it towards Silverdale. Now, as far as Salt Marsh goes, which is shown in green here, you can see there was a strip of salt marsh from the Arnside Viaduct down to the north side of Home Island. But along here, there was no salt marsh. On the Silverdale side, on the other hand, as we've already seen from the previous photograph, there was this very large marsh from Park Point here, past Silverdale Village and right down to Jenny Brown's Point, and actually extending west of Jenny Brown's Point. So that was the situation in 1963. Now moving on to 1972, the tide level was rather different, so the channel is looking obviously quite different from what it did in the previous slide. It's very much narrower here when a survey was done at virtually low water. Now again, we can see that the channel lays along the side of the estuary from Arnside to Blackstone Point. It then swung across towards Kent's Bank and then curved almost at right angles to pass southeastwards further south. The only trace of the channel that had been along the edge of the Grange side in 1963 is this small remnant channel. So quite a different channel pattern then by 1972. Now, as far as the Salt Marsh is concerned, again the Salt Marsh north of Home Island, the survey did cut off just before the viaduct, so it can't be strictly compared, but you can see the distribution is very similar to what it was in 1963. The Silverdale Salt Marsh, very large extents of salt marsh, and there is some lighter green here, which is showing that it had expanded a bit between 1963 and 1972. And otherwise, very extensive sandbanks on either side of the channel. Now, unfortunately, we have to then move 20 years on because there was no total survey during that intervening 20 years. There were partial surveys, and I will come back to that in a few minutes. But again, 1992, in May and June, again, the channel is still along the shore from Arnside to Blackstone Point. It's then curving just sort of for a short distance to the shore at Grange over Sands, and then it curves southeastwards to leave this section of the estuary. Again, the tide level was much higher than it was in the previous survey, so you could see a much wider channel here. Now, the Salt Marsh, here you can see it from Arnside Viaduct down to Home Island, but not just on one side of Home Island, also on the south side. And it does continue in little patches along the shore at Grange. And further south at Kent's Bank, you can see that there's a much more extensive marsh extending down to the Wyke Farm Bay here. So that was the situation in the summer of 1992. And the final one of this set of four maps was from a survey, an aerial survey flown in October 1997. Once again, we have the channel line between Arnside and Blackstone Point, but then you can see it sort of swung west, but then swung back again to lie right along the shore between Park Point and Far Arnside, before it curved slightly and then lay north-south. The Salt Marsh, still up here between the Arnside Viaduct and down to Home Island, but then you can see that there is salt marsh, at least in patches, all the way along the Grange shore, and then there's an extensive continuous marsh all the way down to Humphrey Head. So a very large marsh by this stage had developed. And you can see from the lighter green patches that this was very extensive growth in the period from 1992 to 1997. Well, as you've seen, there was a very unfortunate 20-year gap between 1972 and 1992, but we can thankfully fill this in to quite a large extent in the Silverdale area, because there were more limited areas that were aerially surveyed during this period. The marsh at Silverdale started to erode in about 1975. But what we need to look at first is the fact that this was when the marsh was actually accreting, and the date, I hope you can see these. Sorry, I need to refer to my map here. There were surveys from 1964 to 1976. So there were 4 surveys in here, and these have been used to map the age of the marsh, which was this position here. And you can see that there were actually, I hope you can see, there are actually 4 lines which are very close together. So the marsh was still at its accreting or growing stage, expanding stage, till 1976. But then we know that there was a very rapid start to erosion. And the next 2 air surveys in 1981 and 82 take us right back to, there's the 81 line there, and there's the 82 line there. So a huge area of marsh had gone between 1976 and 1982. Now this slide just illustrates what the marsh looked like in 1982. A very different situation from what you saw in 1964 on the photograph I showed taken at the near the Silverdale shore. Here there's the main Kent Channel is flowing very close to the edge of the Salt Marsh. It's caused considerable erosion. This is by the effects of the tides and the waves in the channel. So the Salt Marsh has actually been broken down into these individual turf blocks. You can see 1 or 2 of them sitting on the top of the marsh here. So this was what it looked like in the early stages then of this very rapid erosion. Now I want to go back to the previous slide. I became very interested in what was going on here, and I started a project in 1984 whereby I established a number of profile lines. You can see them here. There's 1, 2, 3, I've lost 1. Sorry, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. and I measured the erosion of the marsh from the end of each of these profiles monthly. And I did this, in fact, right through until 2010, which was quite an undertaking, really, but it was days at Silverdale were so enjoyable, it was something I couldn't really let go. Also, I surveyed each of these profiles with an instrument, so that I knew the exact length of each of these profiles and also the height variations, and that was done every 3 years. So the lines which are shown back here represent these 3 yearly surveys. So you can see, I think, very steady erosion, right back to the final one in 2005, which you may not be able to make out, but the marsh is just limited to an area where there's a white line there, and also at the cove. And that was all that was left by 2005 of this kilometre-wide marsh, which had existed up to 1975, possibly 1976. So quite a story there as to what's been happening at Silverdale. And basically this erosion was the result of the channel, the main Kent channel, lying very close to the edge of the marsh, so that the tidal streams and the waves were able to very easily erode at the edge of the relatively soft marsh. So quite a lot was happening on this east side of the estuary from 1964, and you can see it depicted there to 2005. But the final marsh, final bits of marsh didn't really disappear until 2010. So quite a saga there for Silverdale Salt Marsh. So what was happening on the other side of the estuary? Well, it all looked very different. You remember Kent's Bank back in the 60s, we just had a lovely shore and a main channel very close by. When the channel moved over towards the eastern side of the estuary, towards the Silverdale Salt Marsh, and steadily eroded it, the energy conditions were much lower on the west side of the estuary. So conditions were still sandy, but they were much more towards muddy. And the environment was in fact very suitable for colonisation by Spartina grass. So what you see here in 1987, this is a photograph taken also at Kent's Bank, by Kent's Bank Station, to give you a fairly precise location. You can see that there was this extensive colonisation of individual clumps and one or two sort of individual sprigs, smaller than clumps, colonising this sort of muddy sand in 1987. In fact, this had started in the mid-1980s. So that's 87. By the time we move on to 1991, and I'm sorry, this slide was taken in rain, so it's a rather murky one, but you can see how much the salt marsh has consolidated. The Spartina clumps have joined together, and there's a much denser cover of marsh. Again, just by Kent's Bank Station. Now this takes us on to 1998, and you might think it was a completely different place, but it is still the same location, near Kent's Bank Station, looking east in this case, rather than south towards Humphrey Head, and you can see that a very extensive salt marsh had developed, looking not dissimilar from what the Silverdale salt marsh looked like in the 1960s and early 1970s. Still a little bit of Spartina, showing in its sort of winter yellowy gold colour, but quite a lot of other grasses coming in the succession. So that's 98. Now what we'll do is, just as it were, take a walk along Grange Promenade, going north from Kent's Bank to see what's showing up here. And you can see this is north of the old baths, which I think you'll probably know the location of, on Grange Promenade. And you can see that there is patchy spartina, a little bit of other grasses coming in, but not as consolidated, obviously, as it was at Kent's Bank. And going further north again along the Grange Promenade, this is just south of Grange Station, which you can see here. Here, the spartina again, there's also other grasses coming in. So this is the new Salt Marsh developing. This is the north end of the promenade, north of Grange Old Sands, north of Grange Old Sands Station, and you can see that the spartina is quite patchy at this point. So that was what has been happening over on the west side of the estuary while the Silverdale Salt Marsh was eroding. But we'll take this a little bit nearer the present, and we'll come to 2006, a photograph taken again from the Kent's Bank station area, looking east, and you can see a very much maturing marsh, a very wide marsh here. So this marsh build-up was going on throughout this period. Now we just go again along the promenade. Here we're again north of the old baths, so similar position to the position on the previous sequence. And you can see that there's a very well consolidated marsh now, mainly of spartina. And this is north of the station, which looks quite different from what you saw in the last sequence of slides. A very well consolidated and quite wide marsh here. So it looked as though there was going to be this steady build-up of marsh on the Grange side. However, this is a sequence of maps which shows what was happening to the channel over on the Silverdale side between 2006 and 07. Although I drew maps at monthly intervals associated with each of my monthly measurements of the erosion, these maps have just been plotted at 3 monthly intervals. So that in fact is September 06, December 06, March 07, June 07 and September 07. And the really important thing to note here is that in September 06 there was a very large channel along the whole of the Silverdale shore. It was being fed in by channels from the north, but also one coming in from the west. When we get to December, this was the 11th of December, I think, again a major channel feeding in this time from the west and all the way along the Silverdale shore. So very active erosion going on still, even though most of the marsh had disappeared, but still eroding the marsh that was there. Now, when we come to March, we see a completely different pattern. There's no joining of the main channel into this channel which lays along the Silverdale shore. In other words, the main channel, in fact, is down here and quite separate. And we know, I know from the monthly surveys that the actual breaching, as it were, of this channel occurred between that survey in December and one in January, about 4 weeks later. So it did actually, we definitely can pin it down to a particular month between December 06 and January 07. So a very big change occurred. Looking at the tidal records, both for Heysham, you've seen a sample of that, and also for the Winster tide gauge, which is just north of Home Island, it wasn't obvious that there was anything in the tidal record that explained this. But looking at the record of river flow, that's the flow of water coming down from the southeastern Lake District through the Kent estuary, there was quite a marked period of rapid flow. And it seems that that was probably what caused the change. But it's still very difficult to be absolutely sure about that. But this was a very important change because the main channel moved across. You can see it's down here in March 07, but by June 07 it was further away from the marsh, and then by September it's right down over here. So a quite marked movement of the channel. Now, a friend of mine was very interested in what was going on the Grange side, and actually took a whole series of measurements of the erosion that started to happen in April. At least the measurements are from April 2007, so very shortly after that movement of the channel. So what seemed to happen was that the channel moved from the east side of the estuary into the middle, and you've seen that on the map, but then it also then moved across to the western side. So initially there's a very rapid rise in the rate of erosion for the period between April and July. That's this very steep rise in the curve there. And that was when the channel was actually cutting into the sandbank. So of course the sand, of course, not offering much resistance and eroding very rapidly. But then the channel got to the edge of the Salt Marsh. And so the rate slowed down, but it was still relatively rapid. And this is shown here, continuing like this through to 2013. And in fact, it's going on at the present time. This graph was just plotted to 2013 for sort of convenience in showing what was going on over that period. So a very marked change then took place between 2006, when there was rapid erosion still affecting the Silverdale shore, to 2007, where rapid erosion began to affect the Grange Salt Marsh. So we will now come to the final group of slides, and these are coming as up to date as I can. And these are photographs on the Kentsbank side that were taken in November 22, so last November. Now this is a slide at Kentsbank, as you can see. It's looking northeast towards Arnside Knot, rather than sort of east, which the previous slides had looked. A very mature marsh here, but a marsh that was had been very rapidly eroded. And just to quote some figures, that marsh grew in width to almost 1,200 metres, so wider than the Silverdale Marsh was at its widest at about 1 kilometre. So that was the widest it got to. By a year ago, and I'm afraid my needs have meant that I've stopped doing the surveys there, so my data only goes to February 22 rather than February 23. But 22, about 560 metres were left of that. So as a percentage, only about 48% of the width of that marsh was left. So all that had been eroded between 2007 and 2022. If we now go north along the Grange Promenade, here we have a photograph of the marsh. I think you can probably see at a glance that it's much narrower by November 22. I had a profile just south of the old baths, but conditions were very similar north and south. And that marsh was about 590 metres wide at its widest, and by a year ago it was reduced to 140 metres. So in other words, there was only 24% of the width of that marsh left by 2022. And then if we go further north, I have a profile line that I established there back in 2009. And you can see at a glance here that this marsh is much narrower. So that marsh grew to round about 460 metres wide, much narrower than the Kent's Bank. And a year ago it was reduced to just 88 metres. So in other words, there was only 19% of that marsh left by 2022. So a huge amount of erosion took place between 2007, when the channel moved, to a year ago, 2022. And that, I know, is still continuing, even though I had to suspend my measurements. And this is just a view at Grange, by Grange Station. You can see there's a moderate channel. This isn't the main channel, but nevertheless it is allowing quite a lot of erosion to still affect this marsh. You can see the vertical cliff at the edge of the marsh, and then some of the blocks which have been eroded off. So that is bringing us almost up to date on the Grange side, but of course we need to have a look at what was going on the Silverdale side before I finish. So here we're coming back to Silverdale Shore, where there was in 1964, remember, this very wide marsh, sheep grazed and with turf cutting. What was present in November last year was just a narrow strip, but of new marsh. So it is a marsh which is growing again. The golden coloured grasses are the Spartina, but there are also other other grasses higher in the succession coming in. So that's the, as it were, current position of Silverdale, and it looks very much like that today when I paid a visit before I came here. And the next photograph is taken further north of Silverdale Cove, just where the road dips down very close to the shore. You'll probably be quite familiar with this, or many of you will be. And you can see that there is extensive clumps of Spartina, so there is marsh beginning to recolonise here. And then the final slide is a view at Far Arnside, and once again you can see that there are Spartina clumps looking rather like the Spartina clumps that we saw at Kent's Bank back in 1987. So there are signs all the way along that Silverdale shore of regrowth of marsh. But obviously it's far from consolidating in most places, apart from just that narrow strip at Silverdale. But just to, as it were, come round the full circle in the 60 years I've been looking at, you can perhaps see a small area of Salt Marsh there. See it showing green. It's being preserved because of rocks on the seaward side, but that is actually part of that earlier marsh. So it's part of what was there in 1964. Still just a very small pocket remaining of it. So I think you'll probably agree that there have been really quite remarkable changes over the last 60 years and affecting both sides of the estuary in the opposite way. And of course the changes are going on into the future, but exactly what form they'll take really depends on where the channel lies, whether it's close to the Silverdale side, causing erosion there, or close to the Grange side, causing erosion on that side. But I hope that's shown you that we have got some very interesting changes going on in the